The sunrise over the Black Spine Mountains painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, and Yuna sat on a boulder watching the light spread across the canyon around her. Cubs and warriors worked together to clear paths through the rubble, and for the first time since she arrived on Varak Prime, no one looked at her with contempt. Warchief Krasix limped toward her. Supported by two of his warriors, his leg had been splinted with materials from Yuna's survival kit, and his face showed the pain of every step. But he made those steps anyway, because Vorak pride demanded that he thank her. Standing up, human, he said, then stopped and shook his head. No, Yuna Park. I owe you more than I can repay. You owe me nothing, she said, because I only did what anyone would do. That is not true, Krasix replied. And we both know it, because most would have stayed safe at the academy, and most would have fled when they saw the swarm, and most would never have thought to fight Shriekwings with traps instead of claws. He lowered himself painfully onto a boulder beside her. The missing students? Yuna asked. Did you find them? Alive? Krasix confirmed. They had found a cave system and sealed themselves inside, and when the swarm collapsed, our warriors were able to reach them. Relief washed through Yuna. Warm and overwhelming. Then it was worth it, she said. More than worth it, Krasix agreed. Because you saved not just my warriors, but also something more important. What do you mean? He gestured toward the cubs working in the canyon. Look at them, he said. Look at how they work together, how they communicate, how they use their environment instead of fighting against it. Yuna watched as Soren directed a group of larger cubs in moving a boulder, showing them the leverage points that would make the task easier. Vika stood nearby, and when a warrior tried to dismiss Soren's suggestion, she stepped forward and growled something that made the warrior step back. He never would have stood up for the small one before, Krasix observed, and she never would have listened to someone weaker than herself. But you changed them. I only showed them a different way of thinking, Yuna said. You showed them that strength is not the only path to survival, Krasix corrected. And for Varak, that is a revolutionary idea. The journey back to Thornscale Academy took 2 days, and Yuna spent most of it answering questions from cubs and warriors alike. They wanted to know more about human survival techniques, about the history of her species, about the world that had produced creatures who thought in such strange and effective ways. Tell us about the mammoth hunters again, Soren asked on the second night. As they camped in the foothills, Yuna smiled and began the story once more. But this time, she noticed that even the adult warriors had gathered to listen. My ancestors lived in a time of ice and cold, she said, and the mammoths were the largest creatures on land, covered in thick fur and armed with tusks longer than a Varak is tall, and humans hunted them, Veka said. With no claws or fangs, with patience and planning, Yuna confirmed, because they would track a mammoth for days, learning its patterns, and then they would drive it toward a cliff or a pit trap, and the land itself would make the kill. The land fights for you, Thresh repeated. And the phrase had become something of a mantra among the cubs, always, Yuna said. Because a smart hunter uses every advantage, and the world is full of advantages if you know how to see them. They arrived at the academy to a hero's welcome. Word of the rescue had spread ahead of them, and the story had grown in the telling by the time they reached the gates. Every student and instructor had gathered to see the human who had defeated a Shriekwing swarm with nothing but traps and determination. Krasix called a formal assembly, and Yuna stood on the platform beside him as he addressed the academy. I once called this human prey, he announced, and his voice carried across the silent hall. I once said that soft creatures had nothing to teach predators, but I was wrong. He turned to face Yuna directly. Yuna Park saved my life and the lives of my warriors, he continued. And she did it using skills that we had dismissed as worthless. And so I ask her now to accept a permanent position at Thornscale Academy. Murmurs swept through the crowd. But Krasix raised his hand for silence, not as an exchange instructor, he clarified, but as a full faculty member with all the rights and honors the position holds. Yuna felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. I accept, she said simply. The cubs cheered, and even the adult warriors joined in the applause later that evening. Yuna found Soren alone in the training yard. He was working on a snare trap, his small claws moving with practiced precision through the knots. You have gotten better, she observed. I had a good teacher, he replied, then hesitated. Can I ask you something? Of course. The other cubs still call me Runt sometimes, he said. And I am still smaller than all of them, so how do I prove that I am not worthless? Yuna sat down beside him and watched him work for a moment. Do you remember what I told you about humans? She asked. That you became apex predators through cleverness instead of strength. That is part of it, she said, but there is something else. Because humans are also exceptional at one thing that many species overlook. What is that? Teaching, Yuna said. Because knowledge is only valuable if you pass it on. And the smallest human who teaches others becomes more powerful than the strongest human, who keeps everything to themselves. Soren considered this, and his eyes slowly widened with understanding. So if I teach what you taught me, then you become something more than just a small cub. Yuna finished. And you become the one who makes everyone around you stronger. A few weeks later, Yuna walked through the academy grounds and came across an unexpected sight. Soren stood before a class of younger cubs, even smaller than he was, and he was demonstrating how to build a basic snare trap. His movements were confident and precise, and the young ones watched him with the same fascination that he had once shown toward Yuna. One of the cubs noticed Yuna watching and asked Soren who had taught him. Soren looked up and met her eyes across the training yard. The human, he said simply, and there was pride in his voice. Yuna smiled and continued on her way, and she knew that something had changed forever on Varak Prime. The predators had learned to think like humans, and the universe would never be quite the same. The assembly hall of Thornscale Academy could hold 1,000 Varak warriors, and tonight it felt small with tension. Yuna stood at the back of the crowd, the only human among hundreds of scaled predators, and she listened as Warchief Krasix explained the situation. 12 senior students entered the Blackspine Mountains 3 days ago for their final wilderness trial, he announced from the raised platform. They were expected to return yesterday, but we have received no communication since the storm began. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Yuna noticed that even the hardened warriors looked concerned, and that worried her more than anything. Krasix had said, "A rescue party will depart within the hour." Krasix continued, "I will lead it personally, and we will bring our students home." After the assembly ended, Yuna approached the planning table where Krasix and his senior instructors studied terrain maps. They ignored her presence until she spoke. "Warchief, I would like to join the rescue party." Krasix did not even look up from the maps. "Denied," he said simply. "I have extensive training in mountain survival," she pressed, "and I may be able to help." Now he looked at her, and his expression mixed irritation with dark amusement. "Human, you would slow us down," he said. "Our warriors can cover ground at speeds you cannot match, and we cannot afford to carry dead weight on a rescue mission." "Then let me take my students and follow at our own pace," she said. "We can serve as a backup team if something goes wrong." One of the senior instructors hissed with laughter. "Cubs and a human as backup," he said. "You would need rescue yourselves within hours." Yuna kept her focus on Krasix. "I understand your concerns," she said, "but I have survived situations that would kill most beings in this galaxy, and I did it without claws or fangs or armor." Krasix studied her for a long moment, then shrugged his massive shoulders. "Do as you wish," he said. But if you enter those mountains, you are responsible for yourself and any cubs foolish enough to follow you. And the Academy accepts no liability for your deaths. Agreed, Yuna said. She found her students in their quarters, huddled together and speaking in hushed voices when she entered. They fell silent and watched her with wary eyes. The rescue party leaves soon, Yuna announced. And I intend to follow with anyone willing to come. Why? Vecca demanded. You heard Krasix dismiss you. So why would you risk yourself for Vorik students? Because those students need help, Yuna said. And because this is a chance for you to learn something your regular training cannot teach. Soren stepped forward, his smaller frame trembling slightly but his voice steady. I will come, he said. Vecca made a disgusted sound. Of course the runt volunteers, she said. He has nothing to lose. And what about you, Vecca? Yuna asked. Are you afraid to prove yourself in a real situation? The larger cub's eyes narrowed dangerously, and for a moment Yuna thought she had pushed too hard. Then Vecca stood up straight and bared her fangs in what might have been a smile. I fear nothing, she declared, and I will come to show you how a true Vorik survives. In the end, all 12 cubs agreed to join her. Yuna suspected some came out of curiosity, others out of peer pressure. But she did not care about their reasons. As long as they followed her instructions, they set out an hour after the main rescue party. Moving at the fastest pace the cubs could maintain, Yuna had studied the maps carefully, and she led them on a different route than Krasix had taken. This path is longer, Soren observed. It is also safer, Yuna replied. And it approaches the last known position of the missing students from higher ground, which gives us better visibility and more options. As they climbed into the foothills, Yuna used every opportunity to teach. She pointed out edible plants that the cubs had never noticed, and she showed them how to read the patterns of animal tracks in the reddish soil. Humans call this tracking, she explained, and it allows us to know what creatures have passed through an area without ever seeing them directly. We can smell prey from kilometers away, Vecca said. Why would we need to read tracks? What if the wind is against you? Yuna asked. Or what if the prey passed through days ago? Too long for scent to remain. Vecca had no answer for that, and she stayed quiet for the next hour. The storm hit them as they reached the mountain passes, and it was worse than anything Yuna had experienced on a dozen worlds. Lightning split the orange sky in continuous flashes, and the thunder came so fast that it became one endless roar. Rain fell in sheets of near-freezing water, and the cubs pressed close together for warmth. We need shelter, Yuna shouted over the noise. There should be caves in the cliff face to our east. They found a cave just as the temperature dropped, dangerously low. The cubs were shivering despite their scales, and Yuna realized that the Vorik, for all their strength, were cold-blooded creatures vulnerable to extreme cold. She gathered dry material from the back of the cave and built a fire using techniques she had practiced for years. The cubs watched in amazement as flames sprang from her friction-generated sparks. You created fire with sticks, Soren said in wonder. Humans discovered fire before we discovered anything else, Yuna said, and it is still one of our greatest tools. They huddled around the warmth as the storm raged outside, and Yuna told them stories of human survival. She spoke of ancient hunters who tracked mammoths across frozen plains, and of sailors who crossed oceans without stars to guide them, and of explorers who climbed the highest peaks of Earth with nothing but determination and ingenuity. Your ancestors sound like madmen, Vecca said, but her voice held something that might have been respect. They were survivors, Yuna said, and they taught us that there is no situation so desperate that cleverness cannot find a way through. The storm began to fade near midnight, and Yuna heard something that made her blood run cold. A shrieking cry echoed through the mountains, high-pitched and terrible, and it was answered by dozens more. The cubs went rigid with fear, their eyes wide. What was that? Soren whispered. Yuna looked at their faces and saw that even Veka had gone pale beneath her scales. That, she said quietly, is why we are going to need more than claws and fangs to survive this mountain. She began pulling supplies from her pack, and the cubs gathered close to watch what the soft little human would do next. The cubs worked through the afternoon and into the evening, and Yuna pushed them harder than they had ever been pushed in the academy. Faster, she urged as Soren wove vines into a snare. Tighter knots, because if it fails, someone dies. Veka hauled rocks up the canyon walls, her powerful muscles straining under loads that would have crushed a human. And she placed them exactly where Yuna indicated. This stone is too small, she complained. That stone will trigger the larger ones above it, Yuna explained. And when it falls, the whole slope comes down. The other cubs spread out through the canyon, each working on their assigned tasks. Thresh and two others gathered specific plants that Yuna had identified during their journey, crushing them into a paste that smelled sharp and chemical. This will burn their eyes and noses, Yuna explained, and more importantly, it will interfere with their echolocation. How do you know what will affect their senses? Asked a cub named Kira. I studied xenobiology for 15 years, Yuna said, and I have learned that most creatures share certain vulnerabilities, no matter what world they evolved on. As darkness fell, the Shriekwings became more active. Their cries echoed through the mountains with increasing frequency, and the swarm above the trapped warriors grew larger. But Yuna noticed something important. The creatures were not attacking yet. They hunt at full dark, she realized, and they are waiting for the last light to fade. She gathered the cubs for a final briefing. We have maybe an hour before they attack in force, she said. So listen carefully, because I will only explain this once. She drew a map in the dirt, showing the canyon layout and the positions of all their traps. The Shriekwings will come through this passage, she said, pointing to a narrow gap in the canyon walls, because it is the most direct route to the warriors below. How do you know they will take that route? Veka asked. Because we are going to make every other route seem dangerous, Yuna said. And the safe-looking path is always the most deadly. She assigned each cub a position and a specific role. Some would throw the eye-burning paste at the swarm, while others would trigger rockfalls, and others would drive confused Shriekwings into snare traps. What about me? Soren asked. Yuna looked at him carefully. You have the most important job, she said, and also the most dangerous. She explained what she needed him to do, and the color drained from his scales. I am not sure I can do that, he admitted. You can, Yuna said with absolute certainty, because you are the smallest and fastest among us, and you are the only one who can fit through the gap in the rock where the trigger mechanism is hidden. But if I fail, you will not fail, Yuna interrupted, because I have watched you, Soren, and you learn faster than anyone in this group, and when the moment comes, you will know exactly what to do. Veka stepped up beside Soren, and her massive form loomed over him. If the runt dies, she said to Yuna, I will hold you responsible. But then she looked down at Soren, and her voice softened slightly. Do not die, little one, she said, because I have not finished beating you in training yet. Soren managed a weak smile. I will try to survive for your sake, he said. They took their positions as the last light faded from the sky. Yuna crouched behind a boulder near the canyon entrance, watching the swarm gather above. There were hundreds of them now, their dark shapes blocking out the stars, and their cries had merged into a constant wave of sound. The warriors below had stopped fighting, conserving their strength for the final assault they knew was coming. Krasik saw Yuna's signal from across the canyon, and he gave her a nod of acknowledgement whatever happened next. He would follow her lead. The Shriekwings attacked. They came in a wave of leathery wings and shrieking cries. pouring down from the sky like living darkness. The first ones through the narrow passage hit the hanging snares that the cubs had placed, and their momentum carried them into the weighted vines. They screamed and thrashed, tangling themselves and their neighbors in an instant wall of confusion. Now, Una shouted. The cubs threw the burning paste into the mass of creatures, and the effect was immediate. Shriek-wings veered wildly, their echolocation disrupted, and they crashed into canyon walls and into each other. Vecca triggered the first rockfall, and a cascade of stones buried a dozen creatures trying to find an alternate route. More shriek-wings pushed through the chaos, their numbers seeming endless, and Una felt the first cold touch of doubt. There were more than she had estimated, far more, and their traps could not stop them all. Hold your positions, she called out, and trust the plan. Soren watched from his hiding spot near the critical trigger mechanism. He could see the battle unfolding below, and he could see the shriek-wings beginning to overwhelm the defenses, but he waited, because Una had told him to wait for exactly the right moment. Not yet, he whispered to himself. Not yet. The surviving shriek-wings had cleared the snares and the rockfalls, and they reformed into a hunting formation. They dove toward the warriors, hundreds of teeth and claws descending with unstoppable force. Soren, Una screamed. Now, he pulled the trigger. The mechanism released a counterweight that Vecca had hauled into position hours ago, and that counterweight pulled a support beam that had been wedged into a crack in the canyon wall. The entire overhang collapsed. Thousands of tons of rock fell directly into the path of the diving swarm, and the sound was like the end of the world when the dust cleared. The canyon floor was buried in rubble, and the shriek-wings were gone. Una slumped against her boulder, exhaustion finally catching up with her. Around the canyon, cubs emerged from their positions, staring at the destruction they had created. They had done it. They had actually done it. Dawn came gray and cold over the Blackspine Mountains, and Una had not slept at all. The shrieking cries had continued through the night, sometimes distant and sometimes terrifyingly close, and she had spent the dark hours planning and preparing. The cubs woke slowly, their cold-blooded bodies sluggish from the chill, and they gathered around the embers of the fire. What are those creatures? Soren asked, his voice still heavy with fear from the night. Shriek-wings, Una said. I studied the Academy records before I arrived, and they were supposed to be extinct in this region for over a century. Supposed to be, Vecca repeated. Something brought them back, Una said, or they never left, and either way, we have a serious problem. She pulled out her datapad and showed them images from the Academy archives. The shriek-wings were nightmarish creatures with wingspans of nearly 5 meters, bodies covered in black leathery skin, and heads dominated by enormous ears and mouths filled with needle-like teeth. They hunt using sound, Una explained, sending out cries that bounce off objects and return to tell them where prey hides. And they attack in coordinated swarms that can overwhelm even large predators, even Vorak warriors. Asked a cub named Thresh. Una hesitated, then nodded. The records showed that before they were thought extinct, shriek-wings were responsible for significant Vorak casualties, she said. Their swarm tactics counter the direct combat approach your people favor. The cubs exchanged nervous glances for the first time. They looked at Una not as a joke, but as someone who might actually help them survive. What do we do? Soren asked. Before Una could answer, they heard something that changed everything. Vorak battle cries echoed from somewhere deeper in the mountains, followed by the terrible shrieking of dozens of shriek-wings. And then silence. The rescue party, Vecca said. Una was already moving toward the cave entrance. We need to find them, she said. But we go carefully, because charging in blindly will only add to the casualties. They traveled through the mountain passes with extreme caution, and Una made them stop every 100 meters to listen and observe. The cubs chafed at the slow pace, their instincts screaming at them to rush toward the sounds of battle. But Yuna held firm. Patience, she reminded them. Patience is what will keep us alive. They found the rescue party in a narrow canyon. And the scene was worse than Yuna had feared. Warchief Krasix lay against a boulder, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. And 6 other warriors formed a defensive circle around him. Bodies of Shriekwings littered the ground. Proof of the Varak fighting skill, but more of the creatures circled overhead. And the warriors looked exhausted. They cannot break through the swarm, Vecca said. Every time they kill one, 3 more take its place. Yuna studied the situation with the analytical calm that had kept her alive through a dozen impossible situations. The canyon walls rose steep on both sides, and the Shriekwings controlled the air above. But there was a narrow path along a ledge that might allow approach. Stay here, she told the cubs. I am going to reach Krasix and assess the situation. Alone? Soren asked. Alone, she confirmed. I am smaller and quieter than any of you. And the Shriekwings may not notice a single human moving along the shadows. She made her way along the ledge, pressing herself against the cold stone and moving with agonizing slowness. The Shriekwings wheeled overhead, their echolocation cries filling the air. But their attention remained focused on the larger targets below when she reached Krasix. His eyes widened in disbelief. Human, he growled. What are you doing here? Saving your life if you let me, she said. How bad is your injury? Broken leg, he admitted through clenched teeth. The bone is shattered, and I cannot stand. She looked at the other warriors. They bore wounds of varying severity, and their movements had slowed with exhaustion. You cannot fight your way out, she said. There are too many of them. Then we die fighting, Krasix said, as Vorak should. Or, Yuna said, you could try something different and actually survive. She explained quickly about the cubs waiting on the ridge, and about the skills she had been trying to teach them. Krasix listened with an expression that shifted from skepticism to criticism to criticism to the recidivism to an expression that shifted from skepticism to do. Something like desperate hope. You think traps can stop a Shriekwing swarm? He asked. I think traps can. Change the odds, Yuna said. And right now, the odds are against you. A Shriekwing dove at the defensive circle, and a warrior slashed it from the air with his claws. 3 more immediately took its place, and one managed to rake its talons across the warrior's shoulder before being driven back. We cannot maintain this much longer, Krasix admitted. Then let me try, Yuna said. She made her way back to the cubs and gathered them close. The adults are trapped, she reported, and we are going to get them out, but we do it my way, not with direct combat. What do you need us to do? Soren asked. Yuna looked at each of them in turn. These young predators who had mocked her and doubted her. And she saw something new in their eyes. Trust. Gather everything I taught you, she said. The snares, the traps, the patience. Because tonight you learn why humans became the apex predators of a death world. She pointed to the canyon walls, to the loose rocks and narrow passages and natural choke points. We are going to turn this entire canyon into a killing ground, she said. And those Shriekwings are going to fly straight into our trap. Vecca stepped forward, and for once there was no mockery in her voice. Tell us what to do, she said. Yuna smiled. And it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a creature whose ancestors had hunted mammoths and conquered a world. And the cubs felt something they had never felt before when looking at a human. They felt afraid, but it was a useful fear, the kind that sharpens focus and drives action, and they gathered close to hear her plan. The shuttle touched down on Varak Prime with a shudder that rattled Yuna Park's teeth, and she gripped her seat restraints until the engines finally powered down. She had seen images of this world before, but nothing prepared her for the reality. Outside her viewport, the sky burned orange with 3 suns. and the landscape stretched out in shades of red and black, covered in forests of towering spike trees that looked more like weapons than plants. "Welcome to paradise," she muttered to herself as she gathered her bags. The Vorak waiting at the landing pad stood nearly 3 meters tall, their scaled bodies gleaming like polished obsidian in the harsh light. They watched her descend the ramp with expressions she had learned to read during her training. Contempt mixed with amusement. Warchef Krasik stepped forward, his ceremonial armor clicking with each movement, and he looked down at her with eyes that had vertical slits for pupils. "You are the human instructor," he said, and it was not a question. "I am Una Park, xenobiologist and survival specialist," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The Galactic Council assigned me to your academy as part of the cultural exchange." Krasix made a sound deep in his throat that might have been laughter. "The Council has a strange sense of humor," he said, "sending prey to teach predators." The other Vorak warriors behind him hissed in agreement, their forked tongues tasting the air. Una had expected this reception, and she simply nodded. "I look forward to surprising you, Warchef." He led her through the grounds of Thornscale Academy, a sprawling complex of black stone buildings that seemed to grow from the rocky terrain itself. Young Vorak cubs trained in open courtyards, their claws flashing as they sparred with wooden weapons. They moved with a speed and ferocity that made Una's survival instincts scream at her to run. "These are our finest young warriors," Krasik said with obvious pride. "From hatching, they learn to hunt, to fight, to kill, and by adulthood, each one will be capable of taking down prey 10 times their size." "Impressive," Una said, and she meant it, but there is more to survival than direct combat. Krasik stopped walking and turned to face her, his massive form blocking out the orange sky. "You will teach a class of 12 cubs," he said, "the youngest cohort in the academy. And you will teach them whatever humans consider survival skills." He leaned down until his face was close to hers, and his breath smelled of copper and something chemical. "This assignment is a formality to satisfy the council," he continued, "nothing more, and I expect nothing useful to come from it. But you will have access to our training grounds and wilderness preserve. That is all I need." Una said. Her classroom turned out to be a small chamber at the edge of the academy, far from the main training halls. The 12 cubs waiting inside ranged in size from barely taller than Una to nearly twice her height. They sat on stone benches and watched her enter with the same predatory focus she had seen in the adults. "I am Una Park," she said, "and I will be teaching you survival techniques used by humans." A large cub near the back made a scoffing sound. "Humans have no claws," she said. "No fangs, no venom, no armor. So what could you possibly teach us about survival?" "Your name?" Una asked calmly. "Vika of the Ironcloud Clutch," the cub replied, "and I have already made my first kill in the wild hunts." "Congratulations," Una said, without a trace of mockery. "That is a genuine accomplishment, and I mean that sincerely." She walked to the front of the room and set down her bag. "Humans have none of the natural weapons you described," she continued, "and yet we became the apex predators of our world, a planet so dangerous that the Galactic Council classified it as a death world." A smaller cub in the front row tilted his head with curiosity. His scales were a lighter shade than the others, and he seemed less bulky, almost delicate by Vorak standards. "How is that possible?" he asked. "What is your name?" "Sorn," he said quietly, "of the Ashkale Clutch." Some of the other cubs hissed at him, and Una noticed how he shrank back slightly, the smallest of the group. She realized, and probably treated as lesser because of it. Sorn asks the right question, Una said, and the answer is simple. Humans learn to make the world fight for us. She pulled a length of cord from her bag, along with a bent piece of metal. "Today I will teach you to build a basic snare trap," she announced, A device that catches prey without you being present. Vecca stood up from her bench, her claws scraping against the stone. Traps are for cowards, she declared. A true predator catches prey with strength and speed, not tricks. And what happens when your prey is faster than you? Yuna asked. Or when there are more of them than you can fight. Or when you are injured and cannot chase. Then you die with honor, Vecca said. As a warrior should. Yuna nodded slowly. On my world, we had a different philosophy, she said. We believed in surviving first and worrying about honor later. And that philosophy is why humans now sit on the Galactic Council, while countless stronger species went extinct. She began demonstrating the snare, her fingers moving quickly through the knots. Soren watched with obvious fascination, while Vecca and several others looked bored or annoyed. This simple trap can catch small game while you sleep, Yuna explained. It requires no energy once set, and it works even when you are kilometers away. We do not need such tricks, another cub said. Perhaps not today. Yuna agreed, but I have found that the universe has a way of putting us in situations we never expected. And when that day comes, you will be grateful for every tool in your arsenal. She finished the snare and held it up for them to see. Vecca walked forward, her movements deliberately intimidating, and she snatched the snare from Yuna's hands with one quick motion. She tore it apart and dropped the pieces on the floor. Worthless, Vecca said. Yuna looked at the destroyed trap, then at Vecca, and then she simply bent down and began gathering the materials again. I will teach you to build another one, she said calmly. And if you destroy that one, I will teach you again, because patience is the first lesson humans learn. The door to the classroom burst open, and a senior instructor rushed in with urgency. In every movement, Warchef Krasix calls an emergency assembly, he announced. A group of senior students has gone missing in the Black Spine Mountains, and a storm approaches. The cubs began talking excitedly among themselves, but Yuna felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. She had studied the terrain maps of this region during her journey here, and the Black Spine Mountains had been marked with warnings she did not fully understand at the time. Class dismissed, the instructor said. All cubs return to your quarters. But as the others filed out, Yuna remained standing in the empty classroom, her mind racing through possibilities, and none of them good. Whatever lived in those mountains, the Vorak were not prepared for it, and neither, she suspected, were they prepared for what would be required to survive.